The morning Edith Walker found out about the railing, she was not supposed to know. She had woken before dawn, her heart hammering from a dream she could not quite name, and she had gone to the front door to press her forehead against the cool wood and breathe until the fear passed. That was when she heard it, not the sound of something breaking, the sound of something being fixed, the soft, deliberate knock of a hammer, the low rasp of a drawknife shaping wood. She pressed her eye to the crack between the door and the frame, and she saw him in the gray half-light before sunrise, crouched over the bottom section of her porch railing, working with a kind of careful patience that made her throat close up entirely. She did not move. She did not breathe. She simply watched the drifter who had ridden into Caldwell, Kansas 3 weeks ago and said almost nothing to anyone, using his bare hands and a small set of tools to repair the railing she had been meaning to fix for 2 years, since her husband died, since the whole world went quiet in a way that felt like punishment. Then he looked up, not at the door, not at her. He looked up at the sky, as if checking the light, deciding how much time he had left before the town stirred, and in that unguarded moment she saw his face fully for the first time without the brim of his hat cutting shadow across it. He was not old. He was not young either. He was a man who had been through something, the same way a river stone has been through something, and the evidence of it was written in the set of his jaw and the stillness in his dark eyes. She stepped back from the door before he could turn. She pressed her spine to the wall and held her breath and stood there in the silence of her own house while the quiet sound of his work continued outside, soft and steady, like a heartbeat that did not belong to her but was keeping time with hers anyway. When she finally opened the door at her usual hour, the railing was fixed. The shavings were swept from the porch boards. The tools were gone, and Edwin Walden was nowhere in sight. That was the moment that changed everything, though Edith Walker would not admit it to herself for another full week. Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1878 was not a town that invited softness. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning against a fence post, half watchful and half exhausted, breathing in the dust of 10,000 cattle and the noise of drovers who had been on the trail for 3 months and wanted whiskey and music and someone to fight. It had 3 saloons, a single church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a land office, a general store run by a man named Harlan Price who weighed everything twice and smiled once a year, and a collection of small homes along the eastern edge of the settlement that tried, with varying degrees of success, to pretend the rest of Caldwell did not exist. Edith Walker's home was the last one on the eastern row. It was a small frame house that her husband Thomas had built in 1874 with lumber hauled from Wichita at considerable expense, because Thomas Walker believed in doing things properly. He had built the porch railing himself, cutting the balusters one by one and fitting them with a dovetail joint his own father had taught him. He had been proud of it. He had run his hand along it every morning when he came out with his coffee, and Edith had teased him about it. And he had laughed and told her, a man was allowed to be proud of something he built with his own hands. Thomas Walker had been dead for 22 months when Edwin Walden rode into Caldwell on a gray horse with a bedroll and a canvas sack, and almost nothing else. The winter after Thomas died, the 3rd baluster from the left on the south railing had split along the grain. The following spring, 2 more had cracked. By the time summer came around again, the whole south section sagged outward at a dangerous angle, and Edith had wrapped a length of rope around it as a temporary measure, and told herself she would fix it when she had the money to pay the carpenter in town, a man named Roy Sutter who was good with his hands but charged accordingly, and spent everything he earned at the Red Dog Saloon before the week was out. She had not fixed it. She had wrapped the rope tighter when it loosened and told herself it did not matter because she was the only person who used that porch anymore and she knew to be careful. Edwin Walden arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late June when the heat was so thick it felt like something you could cut with a knife. Edith was in the yard behind the house hanging laundry when she heard the horse on the road and came around the side to see who it was, out of the habit of watching that she had developed since Thomas died. A woman alone in 1878 Kansas learned quickly that watching was not paranoia. It was sense. He rode past without looking at the house. That was the first thing she noticed. Most strangers who came down the eastern road slowed to look at things, the way people do when they are trying to get their bearings in a new place. He rode at a consistent pace and looked straight ahead, and the only thing that gave her any indication he had noticed the house at all was the very slight turn of his head as he passed, the kind of movement that was almost entirely concealed by the brim of his hat. She went back to the laundry and did not think about him again that day. She heard about him that evening from her neighbor Clara Hodge, who was 61 years old and had made it her personal mission to know the business of every person within a half-mile radius. Clara arrived at Edith's back door with a jar of preserved peaches and the news that a drifter had taken a room at the Overland Hotel, which was what everyone called the boarding house run by Margaret Price, even though it had no official name, and that his name was Edwin Walden, and he had told Margaret Price he was looking for work. "What kind of work?" Edith asked, accepting the peaches and moving aside to let Clara in. "Did not say," Clara told her, settling into the chair by the window with the ease of someone who had settled into that chair many times. "Margaret says he is quiet, paid a week in advance, had enough coin to do it without making a show of it. She says he eats breakfast early and is gone most of the day, and she does not hear him at night." "That could mean anything," Edith said. "It could," Clara agreed. "But Margaret has a sense for people, you know that. She says he feels like someone running toward something rather than away. I think that is an interesting distinction." Edith thought about it while she put the peaches in the pantry. She thought it was probably wishful thinking on Margaret Price's part, because in her experience, people who arrived in Caldwell with no stated purpose and no announced destination were generally running from something, and the direction they claimed to be going was the thing they told themselves at night to make the running feel less like what it was. She did not say this to Clara. She made tea and they talked about other things, and when Clara left at dark, Edith locked her front door and her back door and checked the windows and went to bed and did not dream about drifters. Edwin Walden spent his first 3 days in Caldwell doing what drifters did. He walked the town slowly, spoke when spoken to, drank 1 beer at the Red Dog in the evenings and nursed it for 2 hours, and generally gave the impression of a man with time on his hands and no particular urgency about spending it. The men in town tested him in the way men always tested newcomers, with small provocations and pointed questions, and he passed the tests by giving nothing interesting back, which was more effective than aggression would have been. On the 4th day, he walked out to the eastern road and looked at the houses, and Harlan Price, who was sweeping his front step at the time, told him later that the drifter had stopped in front of Edith Walker's house and stood there for a long moment looking at the porch, just looking, and then walked on. On the 5th morning, Edith woke to find the first baluster replaced. It was a clean piece of work, fitted exactly right, with fresh wood that was slightly lighter in color than the weathered pieces beside it but shaped to match precisely. She stood on the porch and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up and down the road, but there was no one. She told herself it was Roy Sutter. She told herself he had come by early to measure and had done one piece as a demonstration of what he could do, and that a bill would arrive shortly. But when she went to the general store that morning and asked Harlan Price if Roy Sutter had been hired to do work on her porch, Harlan said Roy Sutter had been in Abilene for the past week seeing about a job building a church hall and had not been back. That night she sat on the porch in the cooling air and listened to Caldwell settle into itself, the distant music from the saloons, the occasional raised voice, the horses on the hitching posts shifting and sighing, and she thought about who else in this town might repair a widow's porch railing without being asked and without leaving a bill. She came up with no one. The second morning, 2 more balusters had been replaced. The work was more detailed this time, and she could see in the new pieces a quality of attention that went beyond merely filling the gap. The joints were fitted with care. The wood had been shaped with something fine enough to leave smooth curves where the originals had rough ones, because whoever was doing this was doing it better than Thomas had done it the first time, and that thought sent a complicated feeling through her chest that she did not examine too closely. She asked Margaret Price about Edwin Walden that same morning, framing it casually while she was at the boarding house returning a pot she had borrowed. Margaret was a practical woman of 43 with observant eyes and no patience for nonsense, and she told Edith that Mr. Walden left before sunrise every morning and was usually back before the rest of the household was stirring for breakfast. Before sunrise, Edith repeated. Consistently, Margaret said. I have no idea where he goes or what he does. He is polite. He is clean. He does not make noise. Whatever he is doing at that hour, he is entitled to his privacy. Edith agreed that he was. She walked home with an empty pot and a head full of things she did not quite know what to do with. The third morning was when she saw him. The third morning was when everything that had been a mystery with sensible edges started to become something else entirely, something with no edges at all, just a wide-open feeling in the center of her chest that she recognized and was afraid of in equal measure. She had not slept well. She had been turning the question over in her mind all night with the dogged persistence of a woman who preferred problems to have answers, and in the gray half-hour before dawn she had gotten up and gone to the door, and there he was. She watched him work for what must have been 10 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. And she thought, this is a secret. He is doing this as a secret. He comes every morning before the town is awake, and he fixes what is broken, and then he disappears, and he has never once knocked on her door or introduced himself or asked for anything in return. The question that kept her awake for the following 3 nights was not who he was or why he was doing it. The question was what kind of man does a thing like that, and why was it the kindest thing anyone had done for her in 22 months, and what exactly was she supposed to do with that? She found out his name was Edwin Walden from Clara, who found out everything. She found out he had ridden in from the south, which could mean Texas or Indian Territory or anywhere in between. She found out he had worked at some point as a ranch hand and at another point as a surveyor's assistant, which explained the precision she saw in his work. She found out he was 32 years old, which she thought about in the context of her own 28 years, and then stopped thinking about because that was not a productive direction. She decided she would confront him. She decided she would get up early enough to catch him at it, and she would go out onto that porch, and she would ask him plainly what he thought he was doing and why. She had always been a direct woman. Thomas had loved that about her. He had said once that talking to Edith was like drinking cold water, clear and uncomplicated and exactly what you wanted, and she had kept that compliment in the same interior place where she kept the things that mattered. She set her resolution firmly and went to sleep. She slept straight through until full light. It happened 2 more times. On both mornings she intended to wake early, and on both mornings some deep exhaustion in her body refused, as if the very act of carrying the question around all day was tiring her out in ways that overrode her intentions. On the second morning she at least woke early enough to go to the door and find the porch empty, but the work freshly done, the wood shavings swept, and a faint smell in the air of pine and something else, something like wood smoke and leather, that she identified as the smell of a specific person and then felt ridiculous for having noticed. The railing was nearly finished. There were perhaps 3 balusters left, and then the top rail itself, which had a long crack running along its length that she had been pretending was less serious than it was. She calculated that he had perhaps 4 more mornings of work remaining, which meant she had 4 more chances to intercept him, and she made up her mind that she would do it on the next morning without fail. She was not sure what she was afraid of. That was the truth she kept arriving at and then walking away from. She was not afraid of him. She had watched him work for 10 full minutes through a door crack, and she had seen nothing but patience and care, and a quality of attention that was entirely without threat. She was afraid of something else. She was afraid of the feeling that was growing in her chest like a plant in an unexpected place, persistent and inconvenient and alive. It had been 22 months since Thomas Walker died of a fever that moved through him in 4 days and took everything with it. 22 months since she had stood at his grave in the hot September ground and felt the world rearrange itself around the absence of him. She had not been lonely in the way people assumed she was. She had been alone, which is different. Lonely is wanting something you do not have. Alone is just the arithmetic of a life minus a person. She had managed the arithmetic. She had kept the house and kept herself and kept her small routines. And she had not looked for anything to fill the space that Thomas had occupied, because she had not thought of it as a space. She had thought of it as a shape, a specific shape, and nothing else could fit it. But Edwin Walden repairing her porch railing in the dark before she was even awake was doing something to her that the arithmetic of grief had not prepared her for. It was bypassing all her careful management and going straight to the place inside her that still knew, on a level below thought, what it meant to be looked after. She went to the general store the morning after she had missed him again, and she bought 2 items she did not need and 1 item she did, and on the way out she met him. He was coming in. She was going out. The door of Harlan Price's general store was narrow, and they both reached for it at the same moment. And for a fraction of a second, their hands were both on the handle, her small sun-browned hand and his large one with a fresh callus on the palm and a thin white scar along the knuckle of his index finger. And then they both let go at the same instant and stepped back, and there was a moment of pure social awkwardness that somehow felt more significant than it should have. "Pardon me," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not use itself unnecessarily. "No, please," she said, and gestured for him to go first, and he held the door open for her instead, and she walked out into the bright Kansas morning and did not look back. She walked 2 blocks before she stopped walking and stood in the road and thought, "I am in serious trouble." The following morning she woke before the birds. She dressed quickly in the dark, not her good dress, just the plain gray work dress she wore in the mornings, and she braided her dark hair back loosely and went barefoot to the front door and opened it. He was there, kneeling at the south end of the railing with his back to her, working on what she could see was the last section of balusters. He had a small lantern set on the porch boards a foot away, turned low, throwing just enough light to see the work by. The sky behind the house was that particular shade of deep blue that exists only in the last half hour before sunrise, and the air was cool and completely still, and the only sound was the soft, steady work of his hands. "Mr. Walden," she said. He went still, not with the startled stillness of someone who has been caught, with the considered stillness of someone who has been found. He set down his tool. He stood up slowly and turned to face her, and she could see in his expression the look of a man running through several possible responses and discarding most of them. He settled on something that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance. It was closer to acknowledgement. "Mrs. Walker," he said. The fact that he knew her name should not have surprised her because in Caldwell, Kansas, everyone knew everyone else's name. But it startled her anyway, and the startlement did something to her resolve, and she had to reassemble it before she could go on. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "This is the 3rd week," he said, straightforwardly, without apology or explanation. "Why?" she asked. He looked at the railing, he looked back at her, he said, "It needed doing." That was it. That was the entire answer. It needed doing. She stood in her doorway in her plain gray dress with her feet bare on the porch boards, and she looked at this man who had been waking before sunrise for 3 weeks to repair her railing without asking permission or expecting acknowledgement, and she felt the shape of the thing in her chest shift and settle into something she recognized with a kind of quiet terror. "It needed doing," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. And it did not occur to you to knock on the door and offer to do it during reasonable hours." Something moved in his expression, Not quite a smile, the potential of a smile. I did not want to put you in the position of owing anything to someone you had not agreed to owe anything to. She thought about that for a moment. It was, she had to admit, a more thoughtful answer than she had been expecting. And this way I owe nothing, she said. This way it is just something that happened, he said. The railing is fixed. You did not have to decide anything about it. Except now I know, she said. And now I do have to decide something about it. He nodded. He had clearly understood that this moment was coming and had accepted it. That is fair. The sky behind the house was beginning to lighten, the deep blue softening toward something almost green at the horizon. She could hear the first birds starting, tentative single notes like questions. "Will you come inside for coffee?" she asked. "Or does that put me in the position of owing something I have not agreed to?" This time the potential of a smile became an actual one, brief and quiet, changing his face entirely for the 2 seconds it lasted. "I think coffee is different," he said. "I think so too," she said, and stepped back from the door. He came inside and took off his hat, which was the correct thing to do, and he stood in her small front room with a quality of stillness that she recognized from watching him work. A man who took up exactly the space he needed and no more. She noticed he looked at the room with careful attention, the way a person does when they are trying to understand something from the evidence available, and she wondered what he was reading in the arrangement of her furniture, the books on the shelf, the 2 chairs at the table, one of which no one had sat in for 22 months. She made coffee on the iron stove, which she had already gotten into the habit of lighting early because the mornings were still cool, and she set 2 cups on the table and they sat across from each other in the gray and growing light, and she said, "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Walden." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She noticed that he handled the cup carefully, aware of his own size relative to it, the way large men often are with fragile things. He said, "That is a wide question." "Then start wherever you want and stop when it seems right," she said. He started in Texas, which was where she had suspected. He had grown up on a cattle operation in the hill country south of Austin, the middle son of a German immigrant father and a mother whose family had been in Texas since before it was a state. He had worked cattle from the time he could sit a horse, which in his family had been at an age he could no longer clearly remember. He had been part of 2 trail drives north, one to Abilene and one to Dodge City, and after the second drive he had not gone back south. He had drifted, which was the word he used without apology or drama, simply as a description of what he had done, through Kansas and into Nebraska and back, picking up work where he could find it, surveying, fence mending, carpentry, whatever came to hand. "Is there something you are looking for?" she asked. "Or are you waiting for something to find you?" He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. He said, "I used to think I was looking. Lately I think I might be waiting." She did not ask him what he was waiting for. She felt as if she already knew, and the knowing of it made the room feel smaller and warmer than it was. "What was your husband like?" he asked. The question came out carefully as if he had been weighing it. She had not expected him to ask. Most people in Caldwell did not ask about Thomas directly, out of a kindness that was also a kind of cowardice, a desire not to be present when she answered. She appreciated the directness. "He was a good man," she said. "He was practical and funny, and he built things carefully. He was not always easy to talk to, but when you got him talking about something that mattered to him, you wanted to listen for the rest of the day. He loved this house. He loved the porch." She stopped. He was proud of that railing. Edwin Walden was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I could tell someone made it with care. The original joinery was good. The wood just gave out." "Yes," she said, "it just gave out." They sat in silence for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The sky outside was fully light now, the sun clearing the horizon, and the sounds of early morning Caldwell were beginning to filter in. A rooster somewhere, a wagon on the main road, voices. He stood up and took his cup to the counter the way a man does when he is used to being in houses and knows that cups belong somewhere specific. He picked up his hat. He said, "I will finish the railing today, and the top rail has a crack that wants addressing." "I know," she said. "I thought you might," he said. He put his hat on and nodded to her and went out, and she sat at the table for a long time after the sound of his footsteps had faded, her hands around her coffee cup, thinking about a man who repaired things with care and asked about her husband and called the wood, giving out a sufficient explanation. He finished the railing that morning. She watched him from inside, through the window, not hiding exactly, just not ready to stand in the open and let herself be seen watching. He worked for 2 hours on the top rail, cutting out the cracked section and fitting a new piece with a joint so clean she could barely see the seam from where she stood. When he was done, he ran his hand along the length of it, the exact gesture Thomas had used on Sunday mornings, and the similarity of it sent such a sharp pain through her that she had to press her hand to her mouth. He did not look up at the window. He gathered his tools, swept the porch, and walked back toward town in the morning light, and she stood at the window until he was out of sight and then sat down in the nearest chair and stayed there for a long time. He came back that afternoon, knocked on the front door like a person conducting ordinary business. She answered it and found him standing on the repaired porch with his hat in his hands, which she noted immediately because it was not a gesture he used lightly. "I wanted to tell you that the railing is done," he said, "and that if anything else on the property needs looking at, I would be glad to do it. Not before sunrise this time. During proper hours, if that suits you." She looked at him. She said, "What do you want in return?" "Nothing that you are not willing to give," he said. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Come back on Friday morning. I will show you the fence posts along the back property line. 3 of them are rotting, and I have been pretending otherwise." "I will be here Friday morning," he said. "At a reasonable hour," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And the almost smile came back, and this time she let herself smile back at him, and it was the first time she had smiled like that with her whole face in 22 months. He came back on Friday morning at 8 o'clock with a post driver and a set of auger bits, and they walked the back fence line together in the early heat, and she showed him the rotting posts, and he tested each one with his hand and told her which needed immediate replacement and which could be reinforced with a different technique and would last another season. He was methodical and precise, and she found herself enjoying the conversation in a way that surprised her, because it was a conversation about fence posts, which should not be interesting, but somehow the quality of his attention made even practical things feel considered. He worked on the fence posts for most of that day and the following Saturday, and in between the working they talked. About the town and its politics, about the cattle trade and what it was doing to the land, about books, which she had, and he had not had regular access to but had read when he could. He had a particular fondness for geography, which made sense given his time as a surveyor's assistant, and she had a small collection of geographical journals that had been Thomas's, and she lent him one, and when he brought it back the following week he had questions about it that kept them talking for an hour. Clara Hodge was delighted. She made no effort to conceal this. She appeared at Edith's back door on the Saturday evening of the second work-day with another jar of something preserved and the expression of a woman watching a play she had been hoping to see for a long time. "He is a good man," Clara said. "He is helpful," Edith said carefully. "Those can be the same thing," Clara observed. "They can also be different things," Edith said, and Clara laughed and stayed for supper, and Edith was glad of the company even if she was also slightly transparent. The problem was not whether Edwin Walden was a good man. She was fairly certain he was. The problem was the dark past she kept sensing under the surface of him, the places in his personal history where he went quiet or redirected the conversation, the specific subjects that he would engage with carefully but never from the center of. She was a woman who had learned to pay attention to what was not said, and what was not said about Edwin Walden included a significant portion of the years between his second cattle drive and his arrival in Caldwell. She asked him about it directly one evening in early August when they were sitting on the finished porch in the cooling air and the lightning bugs were beginning in the grass and the day had been good and easy and full of comfortable conversation, and the moment felt safe enough for a harder question. "You have a gap," she said, "in what you have told me about yourself, several years that you do not mention." He was quiet for a moment. The lightning bugs moved in the grass. "Yes," he said. "Is it something I should know about?" she asked. "I am not asking for gossip or to satisfy curiosity. I am asking because I am a woman alone in this territory, and I need to know whether the people I trust are trustworthy." He turned to look at her then, and she saw in his expression something she had not seen before, a quality of being seen that was almost painful for him, as if he had been careful for a long time to remain not quite visible and she had walked past that defense without noticing it was there. "There was a woman," he said, "before, in Texas, a few years after the second drive. I was working a range in the hill country and she was the daughter of the rancher. He stopped. We were supposed to be married." Edith waited. "She died," he said, "in childbirth. The baby also. I was not there when it happened. I was on the far range and they could not get word to me in time." He looked back at the darkness beyond the yard. "After that I could not stay in one place. Every place felt like it was full of something I had almost had, so I moved." She sat with that for a while. She said, "How long ago?" "4 years," he said. "And you have been moving since?" "Yes." She looked out at the lightning bugs. She said, "I understand that kind of moving. I have been doing a version of it in one place, which is perhaps the same thing from a different angle." He looked at her. She felt the look even with her eyes on the yard. "Perhaps," he said. "Her name?" Edith asked. He hesitated. Then he said, "Caroline." She nodded. She said, "Thomas." And they sat together in the summer dark with the names of their lost people between them like something they had each been carrying alone and had, just now, set down in a shared space. It was not a romantic moment in any conventional sense. There was no touching and no declaration. But it was the most intimate thing that had happened to Edith Walker since her husband died, and she knew it. And she suspected Edwin Walden knew it too. He came to supper the following Sunday. She had asked him the previous evening with the practiced casualness of a woman who had been rehearsing the invitation for 3 days, and he had accepted with the careful restraint of a man who understood what was being offered and did not want to take more of it than was intended. She made pot roast with the last of the root vegetables from the previous autumn stores and fresh bread that she had spent an unreasonable amount of time on, and he arrived at the front door at the hour she had specified and knocked, and presented her with a jar of maple syrup he had purchased at Harlan Price's store, which she thought was an interesting choice of gift, because it was practical and sweet in equal measure, and seemed entirely in keeping with what she knew of him. They ate at the table with both chairs occupied for the first time in nearly 2 years, and it did not feel like a betrayal of Thomas the way she had half feared it might. It felt like the house breathing out. He helped her clear the dishes afterward, and they stood in the small kitchen doing the work of it, and she was acutely aware of his proximity and the particular quality of the silence they were standing in, which was a silence that was asking a question neither of them had found the exact words for yet. "I have been thinking about staying," he said. He was drying a plate with great concentration. She kept her hands in the washing water. "In Caldwell?" "Yes. There is work to be had," she said. "Roy Sutter always needs help. The cattle season keeps things busy." "That is not exactly why I was thinking of staying," he said. She looked at the water. She said, "No, no," he said. She set the last pot on the drain board and dried her hands on the dish cloth. She turned around to face him, and he had put down the plate and was looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, more unguarded than she had seen him, like a man who had made a decision that had cost him something. "Edith," he said, "I am going to tell you something plainly because I think you prefer plain things." "I do," she said. "I came to Caldwell because I was tired of moving," he said. "I did not know what I was looking for. I saw your house on the first day, and I saw the railing, and I came back the next morning before light to look at it, and I do not know why I started fixing it except that it seemed like a thing that wanted doing, and I am a person who cannot leave a thing undone when I have the skill to address it." He stopped. "But I kept coming back because of you. Because every morning when I was on that porch, I could feel that the house was occupied by someone who was managing things carefully and keeping everything in order and not asking for help, and I respected that. And then you opened the door and confronted me about it, and I respected you even more. And then we talked, and he stopped again. "Go on," she said. "I think I have been falling in love with you," he said, "for most of the summer. And I am telling you that because I think you should know it and because I do not want to continue spending time with you under false pretenses of fence posts and geographical journals." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the shape she had been carrying inside her since Thomas died, the specific shape of a life built with another person, and she thought about how she had believed for almost 2 years that nothing else could fit that shape. And she thought about how Edwin Walden had not tried to fit it. He had stood quietly beside it and built something adjacent to it, something new, with the same careful attention he gave to wood and joints and the specific angle of a repair. "I am not ready," she said, "to call it the same thing, not yet." "I know," he said, "but I am not unwilling," she said, "to see where this goes." "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." August in Caldwell was brutal, the heat pressing down on everything like a physical weight, and Edwin Walden worked for Roy Sutter during those weeks while continuing to spend Sunday evenings at Edith's table, and the occasional Saturday on whatever project had accumulated on her property that she had been addressing with rope and determination instead of proper tools. He repaired the back gate, which had been hanging wrong since the winter. He replaced 2 boards on the kitchen floor that had begun to give underfoot in a way that worried him when he heard them. He looked at the roof, which she had been dreading, and told her it would need attention before winter but not immediately, which was a relief. They talked through all of it. They talked the way people do when they have found another person with whom conversation is easy, not because there is no friction between them, but because the friction is interesting rather than wearing. He pushed back on her opinions when he disagreed with them, which she liked. She challenged his assumptions when they seemed unexamined, and he listened to her challenges with a seriousness that she had not always gotten from men in her life and was not taking for granted. He told her more about Caroline as the summer went on, not all at once but in pieces, when something came up that made the telling relevant. He told her about the small house they had been planning to build, about the particular way Caroline had laughed, about the morning he had ridden back from the far range and found 2 graves in the churchyard instead of the home he had expected. He told it without performance, just as fact, and she appreciated the lack of performance because grief dressed up as something dignified is not grief. It is theater, and she had enough respect for both their losses to want them told plainly. She told him about Thomas in equal measure, about the way Thomas had whistled when he worked and had not noticed he was doing it, about the Sunday mornings on the porch with coffee, about the 4 days of fever and the way the world had simply stopped being the shape she had expected it to be. They were not competing losses. They were 2 separate histories of loving someone and losing them, laid alongside each other in the careful way you lay 2 boards of different grain when you need them to bear weight together. In September, the cattle drive slowed and Caldwell quieted, and Roy Sutter offered Edwin a longer arrangement, a regular wage to help run his carpentry operation, which was more business than Roy alone could manage. Edwin came to tell Edith about it on a Saturday evening, standing on the finished porch railing, the one he had built back into something solid, and she noticed as he told her that he was watching her face for the answer to a question he had not quite asked. "It is steady work," she said, "and steady pay," he said. "Enough to consider staying on a more permanent basis." "Enough to," he stopped. "Enough to what?" she said. He looked out at the road. He said, "Enough to build something. If someone was willing to build it with me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you asking me something?" "I am working up to asking you something," he said. "I did not want to do it wrong." She turned to look at him fully. The September evening light was flat and golden, and it was in his eyes, and he squinted slightly against it, and she thought he was the most honest-looking person she had ever known, not because his face was simple, but because whatever was in his mind was also in his face, and he made no effort to separate the two. "You are not going to do it wrong," she said. "Ask." He turned away from the light to look at her. He said, "I know that it has not been long enough for certainty. I know that you have things still to grieve, and so do I, and that those things do not simply finish being true because we have found something new. I know that you are perfectly capable of managing this house and your life without me. I'm not asking because I think you need me to." "I know that," she said. "I am asking," he said, "because I would like to spend the rest of my life in whatever place you are in, and because I would like to keep fixing things when they break, with your permission and at reasonable hours. And because I love you, Edith Walker, in a way that is specific to you and does not replace anything I have felt before but sits beside it, and I think you might love me the same way." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the top rail of the finished porch. She felt the calluses and the scar on his knuckle and the warmth of his skin in the September air. She said, "I do love you that way. I have known it for about 6 weeks and been very stubborn about admitting it." He turned his hand under hers and held it. He said, "Is that a yes?" "It is an absolutely unambiguous yes," she said. He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding that breath for longer than the question, perhaps for the whole summer, perhaps for longer. They were married in October 1878 in the Caldwell church, which was also the schoolhouse, and the minister who married them was a man named Reverend Fields, who had been in Caldwell for 3 years and had a talent for making ceremonial language feel like it meant something. Clara Hodge cried from the second row. Margaret Price attended and nodded with the satisfaction of a woman who has observed a situation from its earliest stages and found the outcome entirely appropriate. Roy Sutter stood up for Edwin, and Edith's friend from the eastern end of town, a woman named Frances Burrell, who had been helping her with the garden all summer, stood up for Edith. Edwin wore his best shirt, which was dark blue and clean and fitted him well. Edith wore the dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a dry goods in Wichita, a fine wool in deep green that Clara had told her made her eyes look like river water in shade, which was a comparison Edith had privately thought was ridiculous and had appreciated tremendously. She carried a small bunch of autumn wildflowers that Frances had found along the road that morning, yellows and browns, and the last of the season's purple. And when Edwin took her hand at the altar, she felt the calluses and the scar on his knuckle for the second time and thought of the first time she had felt them, and felt the specific continuity of that, the through line from that September evening to this October one. He said his vows in the same voice he used for everything, low and even and meaning every word. She said hers clearly and without trembling, looking him in the eyes. When Reverend Fields said what he said and Edwin kissed her, gentle and certain, she heard Clara Hodge weeping openly in the second row and Roy Sutter saying something under his breath that sounded like "about time." And she thought that this was exactly the right amount of ceremony for the life she intended to live. They spent their first night as husband and wife in Edith's house, which they had spent the previous 2 weeks quietly rearranging, not erasing the evidence of Thomas, but making room for Edwin as well, which Edith had managed with a kind of deliberate care, putting Thomas's things not away but into places where they belonged to the house rather than occupying the center of it, which seemed right. Edwin had brought almost nothing with him from the boarding house. A bedroll, a canvas sack, his tools, the geographical journal she had lent him and he had quietly kept, and a small wooden box that he set on the shelf in the bedroom without comment. She noticed it but did not ask, and 3 days into their marriage he opened it himself and showed her what was inside, a small daguerreotype of Caroline, a folded letter, and a tiny silver ring. He did not explain at length. He simply said, "These are what I have of her. I want you to know they are here." She looked at the items. She said, "Of course they are here. She was part of making you who you are." He closed the box and put it back on the shelf, and she thought that they had, in that moment, done something that most people spent years getting wrong. The winter came in hard in November, which it could do in Kansas with very little warning, the temperature dropping overnight, and the wind coming off the plains like something with a personal grievance. Edwin worked with Roy Sutter when the weather allowed and spent the housebound days building things. A proper workbench in the linta behind the house, new kitchen shelves, a chair he made from scratch that was better than any of the existing chairs, and which Edith claimed immediately. She sewed and read and kept the books for the household with the same systematic attention she had always given to numbers, and she helped Frances Burrell with the winter preserving and visited Clara Hodge, and was generally as she had always been, except that she was happier, in a way that she recognized and had been afraid she would not recognize again. Not the same happiness as before, a different configuration of the same fundamental feeling, the world having a shape that contained her properly. In December, Edith Walker became Edith Walden on the official ledger at the land office, a small administrative act that, for some reason, moved her more than she had expected, not the changing of the name itself, but the fact that Edwin had gone to the trouble of making it correct in every official record, because he was the kind of man who made things correct. The winter passed with the slow intimacy of two people who are learning each other, in all the ordinary circumstances that engagement and courtship cannot prepare you for. She learned that he woke in the night sometimes, not dramatically, not shouting, just quietly awake, sitting up in the dark with whatever he was carrying, and that the best thing was to put her hand on his back without speaking until he lay back down. He learned that she had a particular stubbornness when she was wrong about something, a tendency to hold a position longer than the evidence warranted, and he learned to let it run its course rather than pushing against it, and he was patient, and she was grateful for the patience even though she never said so directly. He said once in January, on a night when the wind was hammering the north side of the house, and they were sitting by the stove with books and the last of the maple syrup on their oatmeal, that he had never been in a place that felt permanent before, that every place he had been since leaving Texas had felt like a stage in a journey rather than a destination. "And this," she said, "this," he said, looking around at the room at her, "is the destination." She looked at him over her book. She said, "Then stop moving." "I have stopped," he said, and went back to his reading. Spring arrived in 1879 with a generosity that seemed intentional, the ground softening early, and the prairie grass coming in green and thick, and the cottonwoods along the creek going yellow-green the way they did when the sap was moving. Edwin and Edith Walden planted a kitchen garden in the backyard that was 3 times the size of the one Edith had maintained alone, because Edwin had opinions about squash, which she had not expected, and she had given over considerable ground to them on the grounds that an opinion about squash was an appealing quality in a husband. He repaired the roof in April as promised, spending 3 days on it while Roy Sutter handed things up from the ground and made observations about the quality of the original shingling that were not entirely favorable. Edith brought them lunch both days and sat on the porch and looked up at her husband on the roof of her house, and felt a satisfaction that was entirely uncomplicated. There were harder days, too. There were days when the grief for Thomas came back without warning, the way it did, with no respect for timing, and she would be in the middle of an ordinary thing and suddenly be standing in the churchyard in September 1876 with the world rearranged around her. Edwin had learned to recognize these days by a quality in her that he could not have described to anyone else but knew infallibly. And on those days, he simply made himself present and unremarkable and kept the ordinary machinery of the day running until she found her way back. She did the same for him when the nights were hard, and when he came in sometimes from a full day of work with a look that she recognized from the other side, the look of someone who has been ambushed by the past in the middle of the present. They were not always graceful about it. Sometimes she pushed too hard to solve what could not be solved, and he withdrew in a way that she had to resist reading as rejection. Sometimes he was too careful with her in a way that felt like pity, and she told him so plainly, and he apologized without defensiveness and adjusted. They were learning. The learning was not linear, but it was real. In May of 1879, Edith told Edwin she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch at the end of a Sunday, in the spring evening light, with the same directness she gave to everything. She told him and watched his face and saw something move through it that was complicated and took a moment to resolve into what she was hoping to see. She understood the complication. She was carrying it too. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am," she said. "Are you?" He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture she had made to him on the railing the September before. He said, "I am going to be." She held his hand and they sat with it together, the way they had learned to sit with things, and after a while he said, "I want this very much. I want you to know that. Whatever I felt just now was not about not wanting this." "I know," she said. "I had a similar moment. It passed." "It passes," he said. He brought her hand up and held it against his face for a moment. "We are going to have a child." "We are," she said. Clara Hodge, when told the following week, produced a sound that was not quite a word but conveyed everything necessary. Margaret Price said she had suspected and offered congratulations with the composed pleasure of a woman who approves. Frances Burrell embraced Edith and cried a little, the happy kind, and offered to help with everything she could think of and some things she had not thought of yet. Roy Sutter clapped Edwin on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him slightly, and said something about the territory needing good people, which Edwin took as the compliment it was intended to be. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was brutal in ways that the summer of the previous year had not been, and Edith was tired in the deep particular way of early pregnancy that is not like ordinary tiredness but like being weighted from inside. Edwin took over the heavier work without comment and without making a performance of it, simply absorbed it into his days, and when she was useful, and when she needed to rest she rested, and he never made her feel that either was the wrong choice. She was frightened. She did not say it, and he did not press her to say it, but they both knew it was there, the shadow of Caroline and the other grave in the Texas churchyard. She prayed about it and she thought about it, and eventually she said it out loud to Edwin one night in August when the fear was particularly loud, and he said that he was frightened too, and they lay in the dark and were frightened together, which was better than being frightened separately. He said, "Whatever happens, I am here. I am not going anywhere," she said. "I know. So am I." It was, she thought, the most complete thing anyone had ever said to her. A son was born in January of 1880, in the house on the Eastern Road, delivered by the doctor from town, a sober man named Dr. Calloway who had been doing this work for 20 years and had the steady hands to show for it. Edwin was in the house because he was not the kind of man to be sent to another room for the significant events of his life, and he was more useful than he had expected to be and less composed than he had expected to be. And when Dr. Calloway put the baby in his arms and said, "Healthy boy, Mr. Walden," Edwin Walden sat down very suddenly in the chair beside the bed and held his son with the carefully calibrated grip he used for things that mattered and made no attempt to conceal that he was crying. Edith, who was exhausted and in pain and had about 12 things she still needed to do before she could sleep, watched her husband hold their son in the lamplight and felt the world arrange itself into a shape she had not foreseen and was deeply grateful for. They named him Thomas Edwin Walden. Edwin looked at her when she said the name, and she said, "Thomas was a good man and a good name. Edwin is also a good name. Between the two of them our son should be well equipped." Edwin said, "That seems right." "I thought so," she said. Thomas Edwin Walden had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn expression, and from the first week of his life, a quality of focus that Clara Hodge declared she had never seen in an infant that young and that suggested great things. He slept with the determination of someone who had decided to be good at something, and he woke with the same decision applied in the opposite direction, and he kept his parents busy and tired, and happier than either of them would have said was possible in the specific ways that new children make things both impossible and irreplaceable. Edwin built a cradle. Of course he did. He built it from walnut that he had been saving for a purpose without quite knowing what the purpose was, cutting the pieces slowly and carefully over the preceding months, fitting them together with joints that Clara Hodge said would outlast everyone in the house by a considerable margin. He put a carved detail along the top rail, a simple repeating pattern that he worked at in the evenings, and that Edith recognized as the same pattern that ran along the top of her porch railing. The original Thomas Walker's pattern, replicated and continued. She did not say anything about it the first time she saw it. She looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at her husband and he looked back at her, and they understood each other without words, the way they had learned to do. Caldwell grew around them through the early 1880s, as cattle towns in Kansas did, expanding and contracting with the seasons and the trail drives. The cattle drives were already beginning to slow by 1882, the western trails shifting, and the railheads moving, and the open range giving way gradually to the fenced land that was the future. And Roy Sutter's carpentry business expanded to accommodate the building demands of a settlement that was trying to become a permanent town rather than a transit point. Edwin worked for Roy and eventually became his partner in the enterprise, Roy being willing and the business being large enough for two, and they built a modest reputation for good work done honestly, which in a town where honesty was not universal was worth more than advertising. Edith ran the household accounts, and after a year of doing it for herself, began doing it for Francis Burrell's family as well, and then for two other families who found the arithmetic of frontier economics confusing. And what started as an informal favor became, by 1882, a small acknowledged business of her own that she conducted from the desk in the front room that Edwin had built her, and that took up perhaps 6 hours a week and gave her great satisfaction. Tom, as he became when he was old enough to have opinions about his own name, walked at 11 months and talked at 13, and by the age of 2 had an opinion about everything in his environment and the vocabulary to share it, which his parents found exhausting and delightful in roughly equal measure. He had his father's focus and his mother's directness, and was going to be, as Clara Hodge frequently observed, an interesting person. In the fall of 1882, when Tom was not quite 3, Edith told Edwin there was to be a second child. This telling was different from the first. There was no fear in it, or rather the fear was smaller, manageable, a thing she held rather than a thing that held her. Edwin's face when she told him was simpler than it had been the first time, uncomplicated pleasure, and he picked her up, which he had never done before and which made her laugh, and then set her down carefully and apologized, and she told him not to apologize, and he laughed too. A daughter arrived in April of 1883. She had her mother's brown eyes and her father's patience, and a quantity of dark hair that Dr. Calloway said he had rarely seen on a newborn, and that showed no signs of decreasing. They named her Clara Frances Walden, for the two women who had been most present in her parents' lives through the years of building, and Clara Hodge, when informed of this, cried with a thoroughness that suggested she had been saving the tears for a worthy occasion. Life in Caldwell by the mid-1880s was different from what it had been. The town was settling into itself, the roughest edges of the cattle trade smoothing as the drives became less frequent and permanent residents became the majority rather than the minority. There were more children and more schools and more churches, and more of the institutional structures that turn a temporary gathering into an actual community. Edwin Walden, who had arrived with a bedroll and a canvas sack, and the particular loneliness of a man who has been moving too long, was by 1885 a person the town recognized as part of itself. He had built or repaired or improved something in most of the structures on the eastern side of town, and a fair number on the western side. He was quiet in the way he had always been, but no longer distant, the quietness having shifted from a protection to simply a characteristic, a man who listened well and spoke when he had something to say, and could be trusted with both information and a hammer. Edith Walden had become, in the way that capable women in small communities do, something of a fixed point. She was the person people came to when they needed accounts understood or letters written, or simply someone to talk to, who would tell them the truth without being unkind about it. She had learned to accept help as well as give it, which had taken longer than she would have liked to admit, and she had learned that a community is a kind of repair job that everyone has to work on continuously, which she thought Edwin would appreciate as an analogy. And when she said it to him, he smiled in the way that still changed his face entirely and said she was not wrong. Tom started school in 1885 and immediately distinguished himself by asking questions the teacher found challenging, which Edwin told him to continue doing and Edith told him to do more diplomatically, and they were both right in different ways. Clara, 2 years behind her brother, arrived in the schoolhouse as a different kind of presence, watchful and precise, building her understanding of things from observation before she committed to speech, which every person who knew her recognized as her father's quality applied to her mother's subjects. In the evenings after the children were in bed, Edwin and Edith sat on the porch in the good weather and at the stove in the bad weather, and they talked or read or sat in the comfortable silence of people who have enough of each other to not need to fill every moment. Sometimes she thought about Thomas Walker and the way his hand had run along this railing, and she felt the tenderness of that memory without the grief being the only part of it, the grief having settled into something that could coexist with happiness rather than eclipsing it. She had Thomas's memory and Edwin's presence and her children's voices from the other room, and the world had a shape that fit. Edwin thought about Caroline sometimes. She knew by the particular quality of his silence when it happened, and she did not reach into those silences uninvited, but she was present at the edge of them, and when he came back from them, he always found her there, and she thought that was the most useful thing she could offer, not trying to fill the space that Caroline had occupied, but being available at the threshold of it. One evening in the late summer of 1886, when the children were asleep and the porch was cool, and the stars were the extravagant Kansas stars that she had been looking at for 12 years without fully adjusting to their quantity, Edwin ran his hand along the top rail of the porch railing, the gesture she had seen Thomas use, and had then seen Edwin use that first morning, and had subsequently seen many times without ever entirely losing the specific significance of it. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The first morning I came here, before sunrise, I was going to do one baluster and go, just the one that had completely separated. Then I came back the next morning for the ones that were cracking, and then I came back again, and I kept not being able to stop." "Why not?" she said. He thought about it. He said, "Because the work was good, and because every morning the house was quiet and everything was asleep and it felt like something worth taking care of. I cannot explain it better than that." She looked at him. She said, "You were taking care of the house because you knew someone in it was already taking care of everything else." He turned to look at her. He said, "Yes, that is exactly it." She moved closer to him on the bench, and he put his arm around her and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on the porch he had built back into something solid under the extravagant stars in the good quiet of a life that had been put together from unexpected pieces. "Edwin," she said. "Yes. You fixed more than the railing," she said. "I want you to know I know that." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. He said, "You were not broken. You were managing." "There is a difference." "I know," she said, "but something in me had been waiting to be taken care of the way you take care of things. Without being asked and without making a show of it and without expecting anything back. You gave me everything back," he said. "That was my choice," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was." The summer deepened and the stars turned and the porch was solid under them. And inside the house their children breathed in sleep. And the town of Caldwell was quiet in the way it was quiet at the end of a day, settling into itself. And Edith Walker sat in the arm of her husband's hold and thought about the morning 2 years before she had watched him through the crack of the door in the gray half-hour before sunrise, working with patient hands on something broken. And she thought about the words she had not known yet to apply to what she was watching. Love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in the dark, before you are even awake, and when you open the door it is already doing the work. 3 more years passed and Caldwell continued to change, as towns do when the thing that built them moves on. The great cattle drives of the Kisham Trail era were by the late 1880s mostly ended, the ranchers fencing their land and the railheads having moved, and the era of the open drive concluding in the way that eras conclude, not with a single moment but with a gradual diminishing until one day you notice that the sound has stopped. Caldwell, which had built itself on that sound, had to decide what it was going to be when the drives were gone, and it made the decision that most Kansas cattle towns made, which was to become a farming community and a service town for the surrounding homesteads, which was less dramatic but more durable. Edwin and Roy Sutter built more houses in those years than they had in the first decade of their partnership, because people who had been cautious about building permanently when the future was uncertain were now building with confidence, and the demand for good work done honestly was higher than ever. Edwin hired 2 younger men to work with them, a German immigrant named France who had strong hands and a willingness to learn, and a Kansas man named Henry who had grown up on the treaty land to the west and had come to Caldwell looking for steady wages. Edwin worked alongside them both without ceremony and paid them fairly, which was not universal in the town, but was non-negotiable in his shop, and Edith was proud of that in the uncomplicated way she was proud of most things he did. She thought sometimes about the injustices of the land and the time they were living in, the way the Great Plains had been cleared of the people who had lived on them for generations to make room for the cattle drives and then the farms. She thought about Henry, who worked with her husband and was paid fairly and still could not walk into most of the establishments in Caldwell without encountering a species of dismissal that had nothing to do with who he was, and she thought about how a just world would look different from this one. She talked to Edwin about it, and he agreed, and they were not people who could change the whole thing, but they could run their house and business in accordance with what they believed, which was what they did. In 1888, Tom was 8 years old and had developed a passion for mechanical things that Edwin was doing his best to understand and support, which involved a fair amount of reading he had not expected to do at 42. Clara was 5 and had recently decided that mathematics was her subject, which Edith received with a deep personal satisfaction, and who spent Saturday mornings doing sums at her mother's desk, with a seriousness that her father found both impressive and slightly alarming. It was Clara who found the small wooden box on the shelf in her parents' bedroom one Saturday afternoon and brought it to Edith with the directness of a child who has found something she does not understand and wants information. Edith sat down on the bed with her daughter and opened the box and showed her what was inside. She explained in the language appropriate to a 5-year-old who was also unusually perceptive that her papa had loved someone before he loved her mama, and that this person had died, and that the things in the box were how he remembered her. Clara looked at the daguerreotype and the ring and the letter and was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet she had, the one that meant she was building a thought carefully. Then she said, "Does she make him sad?" "Sometimes," Edith said. "Remembering someone you loved who died makes you sad sometimes, even when you are very happy now." "Does it make you sad?" Clara asked. Edith thought about it. She said, "Sometimes. But mostly it makes me grateful, because the things that happened before brought us all to this." Clara considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "I'm going to put the box back carefully." "Yes," Edith said. "Please do." Clara carried the box back to the shelf with both hands and set it exactly where it had been, and then turned around and went back to her mathematics, and Edith sat on the bed for a moment thinking about the quality of her daughter's heart and feeling very lucky. The following Sunday, Edwin fixed the gate latch on the back fence, which had been sticking in the cold weather, and Tom held the tools for him and asked questions about how the latch mechanism worked, and Edwin answered all of them with the patience of a man who understands that questions are how things get learned. Clara sat on the porch steps doing something with a length of string that appeared to be mathematical, and the autumn light was the good, flat, golden autumn light of Kansas, and Edith stood in the kitchen doorway watching her family in the yard and felt the completeness of it with every part of herself. She came out onto the porch, and Edwin looked up from the gate, and their eyes met across the yard, across the children and the tools and the string mathematics and the good Kansas light. And something passed between them that did not require words. That was the accumulated language of 10 years of building a life together. The language of two people who had each lost something irreplaceable and had built something new from the honest materials available. He smiled at her, the full smile, the one that changed his face entirely and that she had been watching change his face for a decade without diminishing in the effect it had on her. She smiled back. Tom dropped a tool and Edwin turned back to the gate, and Clara made a sound of mathematical satisfaction, and the autumn afternoon continued, and the porch railing stood solid under the weight of a hand that knew it was taken care of. In the spring of 1890, Roy Sutter decided to retire, which he announced with the same practical brevity he applied to everything, and offered his half of the business to Edwin at a price that was fair because Roy was a fair man under the whiskey and noise exterior. Edwin bought it, and the business became Walden Carpentry and Construction, which was written in careful letters on a board that France made and hung above the door of the shop on the western edge of town, and Edith entered the name in the business ledger with the same careful hand she had used for every entry and felt, as she did, the specific satisfaction of a thing made permanent. The children grew, as children do, in the sudden and continuous way that parents are always slightly unprepared for. Tom at 10 was already showing what he would become, a person who understood how things worked and wanted to make them work better, with his father's patient hands and his mother's refusal to stop at the surface of a problem. Clara at 8 was a small, focused person who read everything available and had begun correcting errors in the household accounts in the margins in a handwriting that was already neater than Edith's at 28, which Edith noted with pride and only slight mortification. The late evenings in the Walden house were the evenings of a family that had found its shape. Edwin and Edith sat on the porch when the weather permitted and inside when it did not, and they read and talked and occasionally disagreed about things, and resolved the disagreements with the practiced ease of people who have learned each other's ways of being wrong, and they watched their children grow in the lamplight and the firelight and the good Kansas seasons, and they were happy in the sustained, ordinary way that is not dramatic and is everything. One evening in the autumn of 1891, when the children were finally asleep and the night was cool and the stars were out in their quantity, Edith said, "Do you ever think about where you would be if you had not come to Caldwell?" Edwin was quiet for a moment, the way he was when a question deserved an actual answer rather than an easy one. Then he said, "I think I would still be moving. I think I would have kept moving until I ran out of road." "And instead you fixed my railing," she said. "And instead I fixed your railing," he said. She leaned her head back and looked at the stars. She said, "I used to think that the railing was just the railing, that you came every morning because you needed something to do and it was there." "Is that what you thought?" "At first," she said, "before I understood you better." He was quiet. She could feel the warmth of him in the cool evening air. She said, "You came every morning because you needed to be near something worth taking care of, something that someone else had built with love and that had gotten broken and needed a patient person with good hands." He said, after a moment, "You are better at explaining me than I am." She turned to look at him. She said, "I have had 13 years of practice." He looked at her. he said. Was I worth the practice? She reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, the gesture of a woman who knows someone entirely and is not afraid of what she knows. She said, "You are the best thing I have been asked to understand." He covered her hand with his. The porch was solid under them. The stars were extravagant and uncountable. Somewhere in the house, a child turned in sleep and made the sound children make, the small involuntary sound of being safe, and the autumn night of Caldwell. Kansas settled around the house on the eastern road, and the two people on the porch and the repaired railing, and the life they had built out of the raw materials of loss and patience, and the specific choice, made daily, to stay. Edwin Walden had arrived in Caldwell with a bedroll and a canvas sack, and the silence of a man who had been hurt in the permanent way. He had repaired a widow's porch railing in the dark before she was even awake, not because anyone asked him to, and not because he expected anything from it, but because he was a person who could not leave a broken thing unaddressed when he had the skill to fix it. And the broken thing had turned out to be more than the railing, and the widow had turned out to be more than a loan, and the skill he had turned out to be more than carpentry. Edith Walker had opened a door and found a man building something for her in the dark, and she had asked him the hardest question she knew how to ask, which was why, and his answer had been so entirely without guile that she had understood immediately and been terrified and then courageous, in the order those things require. They had built a life, not the life either of them had originally planned, not the life that had been interrupted by fever and childbirth and unmarked graves in the Texas churchyard. A different life with its own shape made from honest materials, a house with a good railing, a table with 2 chairs, children with dark eyes and stubborn chins, a business with a fair name on a board, an autumn porch and a winter fire and the extravagant Kansas stars above both. All of it begun before she was even awake, by a man with patient hands and a compass bearing he had not known he was following, toward a door that was going to open, and a woman who was going to ask him plainly what he thought he was doing, and mean it, and mean far more than the railing. This was where the drifter had stopped drifting. This was where the moving ended and the building began. And in the October of every subsequent year, when the light went flat and golden, and the cottonwoods along the creek went yellow-green in the fall version instead of the spring, Edwin Walden ran his hand along the top rail of the porch that he had repaired and extended and improved over the years, and he felt the good solid wood under his palm, and he was, in the only way that finally matters, entirely home.